Um, Today's discussion is centering on universalism and multiculturalism. These are important aspects of the globalization process that we have been debating and discussing in this Congress. It's kind of interesting that as we have addressed the issue of globalization, it's become very obvious that the global and the local are dualities that are sometimes not very helpful. And we have had a number of people who wanted to deconstruct that and say we need more flexible ways of understanding that. And I guess in the spirit of that, the debate today, which is whether the processes of globalization homogenize countries and cultures, or whether cultural diversity can be protected, expanded, and enhanced by these processes, one of the critical issues. Another critical issue, clearly, is how we frame those debates. And again, the framing of multiculturalism is one particular way of thinking about that. In my own country, we would see ourselves as a bicultural country, but increasingly a very culturally diverse country. And one recent piece of information was that Auckland, our major city, and Toronto are now the two most diverse ethnically cities in the world. So from a very small country to a much larger country, and across all our countries, I think, we're being faced with very similar issues. At the same time, some of the social scientists have warned us that the shrinking world and global media can accentuate cultural and religious conflicts and even bring about a clash of civilizations. And again, some of the ways that the debate has been constructed has been in terms of these almost like civilizations at war with each other. Several countries are attempting to define a common platform based on universalistic values for national populations that are becoming more heterogeneous. And my initial example about those two cities, I think, underlies the heterogeneity that many of our countries now face. And to some countries, that has always been the case, but for some of us, it's much more recent. And therefore, the ways of understanding that are ones that are challenging many of us. Organizations like UNESCO are trying to preserve diversity by protecting languages and cultural heritage. There's the recent Convention on the Protection of Cultural Heritage, a very important step in that process. But these forces of homogenization through global media are increasing in strength. So we know a lot of commonality of the media control these days means that much the same kind of, you could say, diet is being sent around the world in increasing volumes and speeds. How then can diversity be defended and combined with universalistic values and rules? Should the UNESCO, for example, Declaration of Human Rights be one of the things that we take into account in thinking through those things? So I think that's broadly our agenda today, and we've got some really excellent speakers to help us to think through that. And so our first speaker today will be Craig Calhoun. Craig has served as president of the Social Science Research Council since 1999. He also is the University Professor of Social Sciences in New York University, and founding director of New York University Institute for Public Knowledge. Under Craig Calhoun's leadership, the SSRC has initiated major projects on, among other things, the public communication of social science knowledge, the privatization of risk, religion, and the public sphere, HIV, AIDS, media reform, new communication technology, transformations in knowledge production, and questions how to assess and evaluate efforts to shape societal change. As an individual scholar, Craig has written on culture, communication, technology and social change, social theory and politics, and on the social sciences themselves. Two of his most recent books include Nations, Matter, Culture, History and Cosmopolitanism, and Cosmopolitanism and Belonging. And the University of Chicago Press is publishing a collection of his historical essays entitled The Roots of Radicalism, Sociology in America, and Lessons in Europe, Imperial History and American Power. Throughout his career, he's been involved in projects bringing social science to bear on issues of public concern. These have ranged from consulting on rural education and development in North Carolina to advising the Constitutional Commission on Eritrea to help develop communication infrastructures in Sudan. Most famously, he provided a detailed eyewitness account and award-winning sociological analysis of a student revolt in Tiananmen Square. In his most popular book today, Neither Gods Nor Emperors, Students in the Struggle of democracy in China. He received his doctorate at Oxford University. He taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also served as Dean of Graduate Study School and Director of the University Center for International Studies. He was visiting professor in China, Eritrea, France, Norway, and Sudan. I think you can see, well able to present to us today, and we welcome you, Craig.
In the Internet Revolution, I think he discovered my article in Wikipedia or something. A lot of introduction. In the 1990s, widespread enthusiasm for globalization blinded many commentators to its darker sides and also to reasons why it might not continue without crises. I think we are not so blinded in the contemporary era that first September 11th, then the drawn-out wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the financial crisis which came to a head last year, have all shifted that. Nonetheless, it seems to me that we have kept in place an aspect of the thinking of the 1990s. And I want to try to comment on that aspect and see if I can suggest some ways to improve it. What we have kept, I think, is not just a celebratory tone about globalization some of the time, but an idea of cosmopolitanism which is too often employed as a term of self-congratulation. I think that this is an issue for us in regard to a panel on universalism and multiculturalism because of the extent to which we have ranged two different ways of thinking about what makes the world whole. One of which focuses essentially on the equivalence of all the people in the world and is helpful as a kind of regulative ideal, for example, in theories of justice, about how everybody counts equally to everybody else. The other of which stresses, however, the differences among people in the world, including the different ways in which they belong to a variety of communities, are associated with different cultures, and participate in different social movements and identities. In a fairly superficial way, up until the 1990s, and still sometimes, we simply embrace both of these. We say we believe in universalism, justice for everyone, human rights, the equivalence of people, and we say we believe in respect for different cultures, for recognition for the different material circumstances in which people live in the world, and their different solidarities. But these can often get into a real tension with each other, and the challenge of sorting them out becomes more and more acute. In the 1990s, it was somewhat obscured by a fashion for cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism, in fact, became not just a fashion, but a sort of the fashion in many ways. To be global, to be cool, to be knowledgeable about world cultures, to be a frequent traveler, moving around the world readily, as academics do, attending different conferences. At the time, I wrote a paper called The Class Consciousness of Frequent Travelers, intended to call attention to the extent to which this mode of inhabiting the world actually has a kind of material foundation, a material foundation in passports from certain countries that are recognized readily at immigration checkpoints, in credit cards that enable people to buy their airplane tickets and stay at the Hilton hotels, in the capacity to rub shoulders in the lounges that airlines offer to their most frequent travelers or those who buy the most expensive tickets. I don't mean to suggest that this is all bad, that class consciousness is only a sort of negative thing. What I want to suggest, though, is that it is a kind of consciousness, and in fact, the inhabiting of a kind of culture. Many of these frequent travelers experienced and talked about their globality as though it were an escape from culture. Culture is what those people they left at home had, whereas they had moved into a realm of awareness of the world of a kind of pure reason. A variety of theories in many ways reinforce this, suggesting that the appropriate way to think about the future of the world was to think about it as a progress of reason. And on the other side to this, there was a tendency to dismiss or sometimes even condemn more local cultures, or at least those which we didn't like. So advocates for globalization often involved a kind of false opposition, which was underwritten in part by this experience of the frequent travelers. That is, the frequent travelers' experience of how easy it was to move around the world, rather than the difficulties faced, for example, by labor migrants as they move around the world. The frequent travelers' experience that it was one world and looked pretty much the same everywhere, as long as you stuck to the international airlines and the Hilton hotels. The notion that this world seamlessly integrated a kind of capitalist market culture and political liberalism was reinforced by much of this elite. And then, of course, there were a variety of counter-trends to which a global elite reacted. On the one side, then, was the utopia of cosmopolitan liberalism. On the other side was the specter of reactionary nationalism or fundamentalism. Religion, to many members of the global elite, was seen only in its bad or parochial or old-fashioned versions, and something that seemed to come almost from another time. The false dichotomy encouraged illusions, like the notion that there was some effective way to bypass states and national identities, rather than a need to build better states and more inclusive and democratic nationalisms. It encouraged forgetting that social solidarity depends on mediating relationships and identities and is crucial to both personal well-being and collective action on a larger scale. That is, it conceived of the world largely through the movement of individuals, seeing those individuals as more or less autonomous without paying attention to the material conditions that gave some people the capacity to understand themselves and their movement as autonomous, like those passports and credit cards. Okay? And it paid less respect to the different modes of integration into particular societies. It encouraged the belief that universalism and secularism are escapes from culture or religion rather than themselves cultural construction. Now, to be sure, enemies of globalization sometimes invoked the same false opposition with inverted value loadings. Fundamentalist or national utopia, threatening specter of cosmopolitan liberalism. In all of this, Europe was both a central and a curious example. It was seen by many as the premier demonstration of the possibility of moving beyond the old nation-state model to forge a new kind of post-national identity. I can't tell you how many books were written about versions of post-national identities and the waning of the state. A short précis, if you have something else to do. My claim is that we have not arrived at the utopia of post-national identities and the state hasn't gone away, and therefore that we had better work out how we're going to relate to both. Cosmopolitanism was invoked by those who advocated a more centrally integrated Europe against the ostensible nationalism and provincialism of those suspicious of it. Cosmopolitanism was praised in those who traveled around Europe, ate different foods, spoke different languages, and increasingly identified with the region as a whole. And it was suggested that Europe not only demonstrated a path to the rest of the world, but through its humanitarian and other aid policies helped to promote it. Just to be clear, I think this is partially true, but like many sort of stories based on class consciousness, only partially true. The forging of the European Union is indeed one of the remarkable achievements of the second half of the 20th century. But different conceptualizations are possible. Should European integration, for example, be considered mainly in terms of a Brussels and Strasbourg-centered project of uniform design? Or should it be sought in the crazy quilt of particular connections forged among Europeans? While those suspicious of European designs sometimes speak in terms of national chauvinisms, do they also articulate a concern over the extent to which Europe is designed to serve a bureaucratic, cultural, and corporate elite in its existing structures of integration? Is the building of the EU actually an extension of the logic of the nation-state to a larger level? The integration of different regions in France or Germany was once a cosmopolitan project too, and the European Union is as obsessed with its international borders as any European nation-state ever was. It is not clear that the integration of regional bodies, in other words, is simply a step on the way to more seamless integration of the world as a whole. and it is not clear that universalistic thinking about the equivalence of individual persons underwrites European solidarity so much as thinking about a common European civilization. This is evident all the more amid current anxieties about immigration or the inclusion of Turkey. European integration raises the stakes of the discussion of cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism and belonging. It does not make all Europeans cosmopolitan, although there is a tendency some places to think that cosmopolitanism is a sort of ethnic inheritance, as though Europeans, being descended from the people who produced the Enlightenment, are automatically, and as a matter of their blood rather than their brains, cosmopolitan. I think you can detect this in some of the votes that have been taken in the face of immigrant pressure in various countries. Some Europeans are, in fact, very defensively nationalist. And even many who support transcending the individual European nations in a common European Union are deeply anxious about immigration from outside Europe. In this context, cosmopolitanism has become a favored vocabulary for those advocating both closer transnational integration and a better reception for immigrants. This disguises, though, the tension between those two agendas, transnational integration, right, reception for immigrants. It has also been incorporated into a general rhetoric of progress. So despite the pressures of the larger economic crisis, pro-European elites may continue to voice their aspirations and identity in terms of cosmopolitanism. Looking at Europe is a good basis for asking whether pointing to universal normative standards can be an effective substitute for dealing directly with questions of political identity and belonging. The idea of constitutional patriotism, for example, suggests that citizens should derive enough specific loyalty to each other from the general rightness of their constitutional structure to make other forms of solidarity, most especially culture, unnecessary. This offers at best a thin account of belonging to a political community. The integration of Europe is a good context in which to ask whether stronger, thicker structures of belonging are necessary, and what understandings of belonging may in fact be in play in providing the basis for a growing sense of Europeanness. The issue here is not only what produces adequate solidarity, that is, enough motivation for people in fact to work in a common polity with each other. It is also how and to what extent different conceptions of Europeanness will incorporate and reflect diversity, and to what extent they will offer a one-size-fits-all model, as, say, the European Union when it regulated the correct size of cafe umbrellas. My search is for a more critical and less self-congratulatory cosmopolitanism, one that does not oppose itself to community. And similarly, I want to suggest that we should worry when we find ourselves imagining the substitution of ethics for politics. That is, imagining that the articulation of a right universal order to guide individual decisions in matters of justice can in fact be adequate to the political challenge of determining what peoples will be integrated with each other's in what polities. The cosmopolitanism for which I hope would be a transnational perspective that does not imagine that a global whole replaces the need for belonging to intermediary groups. The imaginary which is promulgated in the name of cosmopolitanism today is too often asocial, that is, too often essentially individualistic, thinking of the world in terms of individuals' direct membership of it, rather than mediations. This is particularly an issue to the extent that dominant cosmopolitan visions of humanity in general, in fact, reflect more particular and particularly privileged positions in the world. They reflect both, A, European and American understandings as the West or the North, and B, the class position of elites who fluidly move around the world. Now, though the latter are disproportionately European and American, they include a growing range of others, which reinforces the idea that this is in fact global inclusion. That is, the frequent traveler lounges include people from Hong Kong and Singapore, from South Africa and Egypt and Abu Dhabi, who also have business or first-class tickets. This is a structure of global inclusion at one level, but of course it is even more dramatically a structure of exclusion on new class terms. The global elites are, in important senses, truly cosmopolitan, but they tend often to think that their perspective is universal rather than grounded in particular social circumstances. They are also prone to think of cosmopolitanism itself as the absence of cultural embeddedness rather than embeddedness in a particular cultural constellation. In other words, to put it in less fancy language, cosmopolitan elites who think they have escaped from culture, which is only that backward, limited consciousness of the less well-off, less frequently traveling people at home, in fact, inhabit a new culture, a culture of people who know how to debate the relative merits of Malbecs and Riojas, who read The Economist and the Financial Times, who discuss whether it's better to send your children to Sciences Po or Harvard's Kennedy School or the LSE, who have opinions on the relative strengths of classical or jazz music, and so forth and so on. In other words, the culture of the cosmopolitan elite is a real culture into which they have moved. It is not the absence of culture. In something of the same sense, secularism is not simply the absence of religion. It is itself a cluster of ideologies. It is a something into which people may invest their hopes or their commitments. Now, the result of this is, I think, a deep misunderstanding among some of the people who are best placed to think about globalization, right? These frequent traveling global elites, and who think about it in a way that is ideologically distorted. Unfortunately, they are us. We don't very often get the business class tickets, but many of us travel frequently enough occasionally to get into the lounges. We move fluidly around the world to conferences in places like Bergen and also all over, though disproportionately in the global north. Crossing borders frequently, we are led to think we know about the world as a whole. After all, we've been to Paris and London, perhaps even Shanghai and Hong Kong. Don't we know about the world as a whole, more than those people who stayed home? But we don't think in quite the same breath, and we don't have the personal experience of other kinds of border crossings, those for whom the border is very, very evident, not so easily crossed. I used to have the highest status in Lufthansa's frequent traveler program, which gave me not only a senator card, but a special ultra platinum or something senator card with a chip in it, which entitled me to a special queue at the immigration service at Frankfurt Airport. Also to a metallic voice, which would welcome me each time, saying, "Guten Tag, Herr Professor Dr. Calhoun." Now, this is a token of moving around the world and precisely a distinction from the way most people are able to move around the world. Let me turn for a moment now to connect this to the issue of multiculturalism before I conclude. In the background to the spread and the weakness of many Western cosmopolitan theories lies what I take to be the muddle of multiculturalism. This is a muddle because multiculturalism very quickly came to mean all sorts of things to different people, embraced and vilified with equal enthusiasm. If anything, it came to mean even more things than cosmopolitanism, which means all sorts of things to different people. Partly because cosmopolitanism almost always stands for something good, unless you are attaching it to an ethnic label like Jew and are describing the rootless cosmopolitans who were sometimes commented on by the Soviet Union. Multiculturalism, which flourished particularly in the latter part of the 20th century, has come under a certain level of attack. The attack is usually a soft one in which people say, that's nice, but let's not overdo it. We should have a bit of multiculturalism, a performance by the children from many different cultures at the beginning of the conference, but we shouldn't get obsessed over the issue. All right? We should give it a rest. We got too involved in the politics of identity, say the cosmopolitans. But multiculturalism was not just arbitrary ideology without underpinnings in material social reality either. On the contrary, it came to the fore partly because of the new prominence of some forms of diversity, such as immigrant minorities, partly because of advances in social movements that forced recognition of others, which, by the way, is part of the reason why some of those others among the cosmopolitan elite would prefer not to be forced. and partly because of improved analytic recognition of the diversity that had always been present, if only observers had paid more attention. In other words, it's not the case that the various nation-states of the world were truly ethnically monocultural. Think even of this nation-state, one of the more allegedly monocultural in the world, divided by Buchmal and New Norsk, divided sharply by the feeling of the rest of the country about Oslo, by issues of East and West, by movements in the past. Even within a relatively small, relatively homogeneous European nation-state, there was indeed difference, and difference over which there could be significant conflict. So it's not as though we have no previous experience of difference before the rise of the identity politics of the late 20th century. Rather, that those succeeded in thematizing the issue of difference in a way that came into sharp contest with the more widespread ideas of national similarity. International migration and domestic politics both figured importantly in this. And if this appeared in academic discourse initially very often as an American phenomenon, it rapidly surfaced elsewhere. There used to be a time 20 years ago when Americans were teased by Europeans. Oh, you make so much of these issues of identity and different group membership. We don't worry about it here. For the most part, prior to the 1960s, nationalism had been strongly associated with the assimilation of minorities to dominant images of cultural correctness. Immigrants should become American, in the US example. Peasants from the provinces should become French. British identity perhaps transcended English, but Celtic, Scots, Irish, and Welsh were expected to assimilate, and very often on unequal terms. There would be a new Soviet man who would speak Russian. Aboriginal children were taken from their parents in Australia to be raised by whites. Tribalism was held to be Africa's endemic problem, a struggle for new nations to overcome, and so forth. In and after the 1960s, a variety of advocates proclaimed the legitimacy and virtues of previously subordinated or denigrated identities. Sometimes these were minorities, sometimes they were majorities. Catholics were as American as Protestants. Black was beautiful. Why shouldn't power devolve to Britain's Celtic fringe? Why should the second sex be second class? Of course, the claims to recognition were not all new. Senghor proclaimed negritude in the 1930s. Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. Feminism could be traced through the 19th century back to Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th, and indeed farther with a little latitude of definition. But the engagement with pluralism and identity was very widespread in the 1960s and the following decades. And the 1960s did mark a shift in the discourse as calls for recognition of legitimate difference began to sharply outpace demands for admission to assimilated majorities. Separate but equal had been a false promise of segregationist whites in the American South and roundly rejected by a mostly integrationist civil rights movement. But now the right to difference without penalty was proclaimed not only by Black Power activists, but by indigenous peoples, difference feminists, and the children and grandchildren of immigrants. From the 1960s through the 1990s, multiculturalism was in vogue. It was the fashion and the way cosmopolitanism became after. This wave seems to have crested. Let me give you one example from my local community. By 2007, a New York Times art critic could write a review drawing a contrast between two art shows, one in Manhattan's trendiest Chelsea section and the other in Brooklyn, one of the outer boroughs, which New Yorkers somewhat grudgingly recognize as being part of New York and which is full of a wide variety of different ethnic populations with 120 languages being spoken in its schools. The critic wrote, "Multiculturalist terms like identity, hybridity, and diversity may sound like words from a dead language in Chelsea, but they are the lingua franca of the Brooklyn show." Now, it's not only that the Chelsea galleries, in trendy art worlds, that identity seems passé. Right? The social science world is divided between a variety of people still trying to work out issues of multiculturalism and diversity, and a variety of people saying that focusing too much on identity is merely divisive and passé, and possibly even playing into dangerous and reactionary forces in the world. Let me give you a quick example of it, and then I'll try to wind this talk up a bit. This example comes from Britain, which has been one of the centers of cosmopolitan discourse in recent years, perhaps particularly influenced by its situation as both a part of the EU and a partner in the special relationship with the US. Let me quote from a liberal democratic politician, this is not a social scientist, who in fact cites Anthony Giddens, however, as the source of his insight, along with Robin Cook. He says, "There are really only two positions in society today. Chauvinist, which means reactionary, isolationist, anti-European, anti-immigration, anti-asylum, thinks one party has all the answers, pro-hanging, anti-abortion, convinced that prison works, Little Englander, centralization, nostalgic for a past world. And the other, cosmopolitan, outward-looking, internationalist, pro-European, pro-immigration, pro-asylum, pluralist, anti-hanging, pro-choice, believes in rehabilitation, multiculturalist, devolutionary, anti-ID cards, anti-war, tolerant, progressive, and forward-thinking. Chauvinist and cosmopolitan, these to me are the big societal divides today," he writes. Now, I think that sort of thinking has become widespread in a cosmopolitan elite and many others who are not part of a very high-end elite, that there are two big positions. The claim I want to make is that this is going to get us into no end of trouble, that thinking in terms of this kind of either-or is deeply problematic. We do not live such that we either are cosmopolitans or we are nationals. We either are cosmopolitans or we feel in some sense an ethnic identity belonging to a culture, deep commitment to other concrete people in a specific network, not just the human race as a whole. We need to struggle for much more of a both-and way of thinking about this. Let me tie it briefly to nationalism as I conclude in this. Nationalism is known to social science primarily through its excesses and evils. We know nationalism through ethnic cleansing, through national socialism, and through genocide. Right? We don't stop to think very often of how closely interwoven nationalism has been with democracy. For example, in the phrase made famous in the United States in the Declaration of Independence, "We the people do proclaim a certain sort of government." The ability to say "we the people" is a very powerful ability, deeply and almost inextricably related to the very idea of democracy, particularly if democracy is to mean a large-scale participatory project and not merely the absence of specific top-down structures. Okay. But to be able to say "we the people" depends on material and cultural conditions and depends on solidarity. All the different national identities in the world are arbitrary. None of them can claim truly to be simply a product of the identities that first joined human people in some aboriginal mist in the different past. They are all constructed. We are knit together not simply as one race, but through a variety of these historically constructed identities. In recognizing that they are historically constructed, we must recognize that they can be reconstructed, that they can be remade and reworked, as indeed nationalisms have been linked to projects of assimilation and changed so that they included more recognition of the importance of diversity. The challenge that I think we face is to figure out, for nationalism, for ethnic identity, for religion, for a host of different cultural and social belongings, how we are going to make them more responsible, more just, and more compatible with growing globalization. The challenge is not to bypass all of these other forms of identities. For actual political struggles in order to make a better world, require working through these identities and changing some of these structures of solidarity. They require us, thus, to be both cosmopolitan and multiculturalist. To be simply an extreme universalist may be the enemy of both. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Calhoun, for those illuminating thoughts that will help us to grasp what's behind all these very complicated concepts sometimes. Our next speaker will be Professor Ümit Özkirimli from Turkey. Professor Özkirimli is a senior visiting fellow at the Hellenistic Observatory, the European Institute, and he is also the director of the Turkish-Greek Studies at the Istanbul Bilgi University. Professor Özkirimli is the author of 3 major books on the subject of nationalism, and I think the titles are worth mentioning because they really will illustrate probably some of the ideas that will be floating around this morning. He wrote a book on the contemporary debates on nationalism, a critical engagement, a second book on nationalism and its futures, and a third one on the theories of nationalism, a critical introduction. So without further delay, I would ask Professor Özkirimli to present his paper.
Well, I would like to thank the ISSC and Professor Gudmund Hermes for inviting me to address this forum and to finally give me an opportunity to engage Craig's ideas on nationalism and cosmopolitanism that I've been looking for in the last 6 years. Now, the title I have chosen for today's talk, Does Nationalism Matter? A Qualified Defense of Universalism, is inspired by the title of Craig's recent book, Nations Matter. Now, the short answer to this question is, of course, yes, nationalism does matter as a fundamental organizing principle of the interstate order, as the ultimate source of political legitimacy, as a readily available cognitive and discursive frame, and as the taken for granted context of everyday life. But I thought I shouldn't content myself with the short answer when I found myself filling out the forms for an academic visitor visa form for the UK a couple of months ago, where I'm currently spending the academic term as a visiting fellow. Now, the questions at the section 6 of the new visa form asked whether in times of either peace and war I have ever been involved in or suspected of involvement in war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. I don't know whether 1915 counts. Whether I have ever been involved in, supported, or encouraged terrorist activities in any country, and this is my favorite, I have engaged in other activities that might indicate that I may not be considered a person of good character. Knowing that I would not be going through this ordeal if I were an EU or American citizen, I thought I should probe deeper into the question, does nationalism matter, and raise 2 further questions. Why does it matter, and should it matter? And then offer a qualified defense of universalism from the perspective of someone who does not possess the kind of password Craig associates with privileged forms of cosmopolitanism. In doing that, I will take Craig's last book, but also his ideas, well, actually, that he presented today as well, as my point of departure. But of course, I should confess at the outset that engaging his arguments is not going to be easy for one simple reason, because his views on nationalism have always been a source of inspiration for my work on nationalism, which I also treat as a discursive formation. And as will become evident in a moment, our disagreements lie mostly in the normative realm. But even here, Craig is fully aware of the excesses nationalism can lead to. In that sense, what follows is not a polemical attack on Craig's qualified defense of national solidarities, but an attempt to point to some areas of tension in his arguments with a view to move forward. Even where we are deeply critical of the nationalism we see, Craig says in his last book, we should recognize the continued importance of national solidarities. Even if we wish for a more cosmopolitan world order, we should be realistic enough not to act on mere wishes. These sentences form the main thrust of his recent writings on nationalism, which consist of 2 main axes: a qualified defense of nations and nationalism, and an attack on what he calls actually existing cosmopolitanisms. Let me begin with the first axis. Why do nations matter? Craig offers 5 interrelated reasons. First, nations are a form of social solidarity. Second, nations form one of the background conditions on which modern democracy has been based. It helps secure domestic inclusion by mobilizing collective commitment to public institutions and underwrites most successful projects of economic redistribution. Third, it underwrites struggle against uneven and disproportionate globalization. National struggles in much of the world were among the few viable forms of resistance to capitalist globalization. To wish it away is more likely to invite the dominance of neoliberal capitalism than to usher in an era of world citizenship. Fourth, nationalism helps locate an experience of belonging in a world of global flows and fears. Nations may be products of history, but they are constitutive for personal identity, social relationships, and a sense of location in the world. Finally, nationalism has been and remains an important source of inspiration. Any account of the political problems attendant on nationalism which does not recognize the achievements of poets, painters, and composers who were moved by nationalist sentiments misses an important part of the story. Now, I will argue that there are problems with each and every one of these arguments. Craig's first two arguments are a version of what I have elsewhere called the public good argument, which stress the instrumental value of nationalism. In a nutshell, this argument takes a shared national identity to be the necessary condition for achieving a variety of social and political goals, such as social solidarity, democracy, or economic redistribution. Yet these arguments do not always square with realities on the ground. As a number of commentators, such as Margaret Moore, Bhikkhu Parekh, have reminded us, the evidence for the claim that a strong sense of national identity facilitates redistribution is far from clear. We know, for example, that the United States has a widely shared national identity and a strong sense of patriotism, but a rather weak record on social justice. In fact, several nationally divided societies, such as Canada and Belgium, have a much better record on redistribution than the United States. On the other hand, both solidarity and trust may have many different sources, not to mention the state itself. In other words, although nationhood may be an effective way of creating solidarity and mutual trust, it is certainly not the only one. In any case, it is hard to believe that nationalism facilitates domestic inclusion, as Craig says, if we consider that the nationalist discourse is itself based on exclusion. As Craig himself remarked on different occasions, nationalism promotes categorical identities, asking people, and I quote, to live in one culture at a time, to speak one language, to espouse one set of values, and to adhere to one polity. Such a rhetoric is hardly conducive to domestic inclusion. Nationalism may sometimes promote the rule of law, equity, and redistribution, but the crucial question is for whom? What about those who do not consider themselves or are not perceived to be members of the nation, both inside and outside the territory of that particular nation? Nationalism helps mobilize collective commitment to public institutions, writes Craig. Which institutions and whose institutions? It appears to me that Craig operates here with abstract and highly benign forms of nationalism with few, if any, counterparts in the real world. I would instead argue that the benefits that may flow from nationhood may be bought at too high a price in hostility to those trapped on the wrong side of the border, that in fact too much emphasis on the poetics of nationalism may lead us to forget the politics of nationalism. Craig's third argument also underlines the instrumental value of nationalism and presents it as the main, certainly not the only, vehicle of struggle against pernicious aspects of neoliberal globalization. This argument appears to lead to a moral dilemma because even those of us who are opposed to nationalism are prepared to tolerate or endorse the struggle of oppressed peoples for freedom or of the poor against uneven capitalist intrusions. I think, however, that this is a false dilemma, even if we leave aside the fact that in most cases it is through national governments that globalization infiltrates domestic economies. Why do we need nationalism to fight against imperialism or neoliberal globalization? Or to put the point more rhetorically, why do we need to fight evil with a lesser evil? It is Craig who reminds us that all such unifying solidarities, and I quote, class and nation alike, are achieved in struggle and at the expense of others. This makes them neither artificial nor erroneous, but products of history. Then the obvious question is, why privilege nationalism? Following him, we can recognize that, and I quote again, solidarities, including but not limited to national ones, are not simply given, but have to be produced and reproduced. So the question, why not try to produce and reproduce other forms of solidarity? The fourth argument stresses the value of national belonging in a world of global fears and flaws. This is a version of the identity argument that national membership is an important and constitutive element of personal identity. The problem, of course, with this argument is that it is based on psychological claims that are difficult to substantiate and to which no one has definite answers. It is true that some people feel the need to belong, but there are others who don't. In any case, it's not easy to prove the existence and extent of such a need empirically. It may exist or may not exist, may exist in different degrees in different people. It may wax and wane over time. Moreover, and I think this is very crucial, we should not forget that the existence of a strong sense of identification with nationalism is not an accidental occurrence. Most national groups work very hard to produce a sense of group identity. There is, in other words, nothing inevitable or mystical about the need to identify. The second problem with this argument is one of scale and form of political organization. Why do we need to belong to a national group to flourish? We all belong to many different groups. Why can't we flourish in these other groupings? The objection here is not that people do not need a social environment to develop, but rather it is unclear why the required environment must be a national one. This point has been given further credence by the historical record. As Craig himself reminds us, national identity has not always been a central component of one's personal identity. For centuries, people identified themselves in terms of a shared religion, ethnicity, language, social status, place of origin, and so on, and many still continue to do so in various parts of the world. Most students of nationalism concede that nationalism is of recent vintage from a historical point of view, and there is nothing ontologically or existentially necessary about it. Craig's final argument emphasizes the intrinsic value of nationalism or the cultural productivity that goes with it. And I quote, "the symphonies and tangos and films and poetry." My question here is simply, at what cost? Are the achievements of poets, painters, and composers a match for the pain and agony nationalism has been causing and still causing for centuries? In any case, we know quite well that human creativity was inspired by other things for centuries. We owe La Sagrada Familia to Gaudi's love for God, not for the Catalan nation. I don't think human beings will have a hard time finding other sources of inspiration if nationalism is somehow transcended. Now, moving on to the second axis, Craig's qualified defense of national solidarities forms part of his broader critique of what he ingeniously calls what he calls actually existing cosmopolitanism, what he said, he just repeated here, the class consciousness of the frequent travelers. These cosmopolitanisms, Craig argues, and I quote, tend to underestimate the work done by nationalism and national identities in organizing human life as well as politics, and miss the extent to which culture is constitutive for personal identity. They also ignore the extent to which roots in traditional culture and communal social relations are basic to the capacity for collective resistance to inequitable social change. They thus substitute ethics for politics. There are two other problems with actually existing cosmopolitanisms. First, they tend to generalize from the bad nationalism of fascism, ethnic cleansing, etc. They see the defense of community, craft, religion, and kinship as somehow irrational and backward-looking. And second, they underestimate how central nationalist categories are to political and social theory. Now, obviously, here Craig has a particular kind of cosmopolitanism in mind. The class consciousness of the frequent traveler refers to the abstractly normative cosmopolitanism of the likes of Martha Nussbaum and David Held, and he accepts that his critique only partially extends to other forms of cosmopolitanism, those that give their ideas more empirical content and that stress particularity, hybridity, and openness to difference. And rightly so. We do not need to underestimate nationalism or any other form of particularism to defend more universalistic projects. We should not, however, make things artificially easy for ourselves and equate culture with national culture. Traditional cultures and communal social relations Craig talks about are in most cases non-national. In fact, it is nationalism which politicizes cultures, gives them an exclusionary edge, turning them against each other. In that sense, universalism does not need to substitute abstract ethics for politics. On the contrary, it should all too often remind itself of nationalist politics and what it is capable of. On the other hand, the fact that nationalism is rational or irrational, progressive or regressive, is irrelevant for the defense of universalistic politics. As Craig himself notes, drawing on Tom Nair, nationalism is Janus-faced and can be both regressive and progressive depending on the particular setting it flourishes. What matters more for the purposes of universalism, I think, is the exclusionary nature of nationalism, its inherent tendency to divide the world into us and them, positing a fixed and essential identity on each side of the divide. It is Craig who reminds us that nationalists often want the sense of national identity to go beyond the feeling of being more at home in one place than another, beyond placing a special value on the traditions with which one grew up, and beyond focusing one's attention more on one subset of humanity than on the whole. As for the centrality of nationalist categories to political and social theory, methodological nationalism, this is indeed a problem and explains why universalistic projects appear so utopian and flimsy today. We lack realistic and attractive alternatives, writes Craig. But should this prevent us from trying to look for them? As Yael Tamir rightly asks in an essay on the prospects of a global state, why aren't discussions of justice or equality considered naive? Why are the difficulties embodied in the construction of just institutions not used to deter theorists from developing theories of justice? Does the inability to realize an ideal in the foreseeable future undermine its importance? Must political theory restrict itself only to offering feasible reforms? One alternative may be to accept, for instance, following Judith Butler, among others, that the meaning of the universal is usually culturally determined, and that the specific articulations of the universal work against its claim to a transcultural status. In the words of Butler, and I quote her, "If standards of universality are historically articulated, then it would seem that exposing the parochial and exclusionary character of a given historical articulation of universality is part of the project of extending and rendering substantive the notion of universality itself. One way of doing this is to set different conceptions of universality in dialogue with one another in order to increase our awareness of cultural divergence and to expand our capacity for transformative cultural encounters. Thus emerges the call for translation." And I quote her again, "Articulating universality through a difficult labor of translation, one in which the terms made to stand for one another are transformed in the process, and where the movement of that unanticipated transformation establishes the universal as that which is yet to be achieved, and which, in order to resist domestication, may never be fully or finally achievable. I strongly believe that it is not impossible to conjure up a form of universalism that embraces cultural pluralism and diversity, one that steers clear of elitism and privilege. More importantly, the pursuit of this universalism need not come at the expense of solidarity, but simply requires the imagining of new forms of solidarity. Craig is definitely right. We should not see nationalism as a fading inheritance or dismiss it lightly. We should not, however, fall into the trap of complacency and forget that nationalism is the very enemy of cultural diversity and cosmopolitan pluralism that most of us cherish. It is Craig who reminds us that with the creation of polities and cultural fields too large and differentiated to be organized as communities, it is crucial to create public space within which people may engage each other in discourse. This is a quotation from Craig. Not just to make decisions, but to make culture and even to make and remake their own identities. This is exactly what nationalism prevents. And this is exactly why we should not fall back on nationalism as our shelter in a world grown too frightening. This may indeed be utopian for the time being, but as Oscar Wilde wrote in his essay on the soul of man under socialism, a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. Thank you.
I think we'll wait at the end before having a very interesting discussion, I gather, from the points of view that we've heard now. I think now it's time to have our third speaker will give us maybe a third position on these issues. Our third speaker will be Dr. Rajev Bhargava. Dr. Rajev Bhargava is Senior Fellow and Director at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. He was formerly professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and between 2001 and 2005, Professor of Political Theory and Indian Political Thought, and head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. He obtained his BA degree in economics from the University of Delhi and his master in philosophy and doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University. He has been a faculty fellow in ethics at Harvard University, a C.R. Parekh fellow at the CSDS in Delhi, Lever Yulm fellow at the University of Bristol, and senior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, as well as visiting fellow of the British Academy. And he was the Asia chair at Sciences Po Paris in the summer of 2006. His publications include Individualism in Social Science, Secularism and Its Critics, Multiculturalism, Liberalism and Democracy, Transforming India, Civil Society, Public Sphere and Citizenship, Social Justice, and so forth. He is consultant to the UNDP report on cultural liberty and diversity. Professor Bhargava.
You can see that I've achieved everything and written about everything. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Right. The title of our panel discussion is Universalism versus Multiculturalism, which is somewhat abstract and philosophical. But the brief that was sent to us had a very distinct empirical and sociological, socio-historical tone to it, and I will stick to that brief rather than get into the more abstract philosophical discussion, which may lead us into issues of relativism and so on, right? I leave that aside and just stay with, in precisely the manner in which my two predecessor speakers have spoken about it. Okay, and the brief tells us that globalization leads to homogenization and as well as to the loss of cultural difference and diversity. And it might also lead to ethno-cultural conflict. Now, it's very clear that there are two sort of directions in which globalization takes us, according to the brief. One is homogenization, and the other is exacerbation of difference. And the whole dilemma before us is how to build global moral norms which would protect diversity without leading, and containing these differences from boiling over, right? Okay, so that's the issue that I would try and deal with. The term globalization has many dimensions, economic, political, but it's also widely seen in a deeply cultural sense as a global imaginary. And in this sense, it refers to the intensification of consciousness of the world as a whole, or world consciousness, the apprehension of the world as one place and one time, and so on. So, mutual contact between different cultures existed always and from times immemorial. But the idea now is that this contact between different cultures must not be seen as an interaction between parallel worlds, but must be seen as happening in one space and one time, and that is supposed to be what is new about globalization in the sense in which we use the term today. It's also a fact, and this has been noted by a lot of social theorists and social sociologists, that globalization in this sense has been in use only in the last 30 years or so. And as I said, the phenomena too is regarded to be new and brought about by modern communication revolution, by satellite TV, internet, mobile phones, 24/7 news channels, and so Blackberries, and so on. It's also widely thought that this globalization has, if not resulted in the collapse of the Westphalian order, but certainly to its undermining, and it's also weakened nationalism. Okay, all this is supposed to be new, but let me now take you back, and I refer to a quotation, and I quote here: "The day of even national cultures is passing, and the world is becoming one cultural unit. Nationalism is fading and giving way to internationalism. Nations may retain for a long time much which is peculiar to them, But with the machine age and science, with swift travel and rapid communication, they will also become more and more uniform. This is a quotation from Jawaharlal Nehru, written 60 years ago. And it's very clear that he uses the term internationalism in precisely the sense in which we're using the term globalization today. He means that it's a social process which is encompassing the whole world. And then he goes on to say, internationalism is a thing of the future. In India, we must develop a truly international vision. We must be prepared to become citizens of the world. It's clear that the meaning of internationalism is now changing from being just a social process. It is now becoming, for Nehru, some kind of a political and moral ideal, which includes world citizenship, or something like, a cosmopolitan, right? In a letter that Nehru exchanges with Gandhi, to which Gandhi responds, they're talking about this issue. Gandhi says, in these days of rapid communication, in fact, he uses the term intercommunication, in these days of rapid intercommunication and a growing consciousness of the oneness of all mankind, we must recognize that our nationalism must not be inconsistent with a progressive internationalism. So once again, the term being used is internationalism, and it's used as a moral ideal, right? And Nehru agrees. And he says, without nationalism, we would be rootless. When a country faces a crisis, nationalism is bound to become dominant. But by itself, it stunts our growth. It is a narrow creed. It limits us and can become aggressive. Nationalism must be connected to internationalism. So without nationalism, internationalism, and this is Nehru again, internationalism is vague and amorphous, an abstract universal. But without internationalism, nationalism is a narrow creed, as I said. So, in a sense, nationalism must be sublated, cancelled, and preserved. This is not Nehru, of course. This is a Hegelian sense, right? Nationalism must be preserved, cancelled, sublated, cancelled, and preserved. And Nehru expresses it in the following manner. We can be nationalist only as long as its doors, the doors of nationalism, and windows of nationalism are open to internationalism. So, you can see that this is the issue that we're facing today. And the three very important concepts that which we are struggling with: globalization as a social process, internationalism as a moral ideal with global norms, and internationalism as a political ideal. When we talk about citizenship in the world, all these are talked about by Nehru and by Gandhi, endorsed by Gandhi. This is this correspondence is taking place about 60, 65 years ago, in the 40s. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is nothing new about the concept of globalization as we use it today, but it's important to put things in perspective. What we've entered is a new phase of globalization. That's the newness about it. The technology is different, the mechanism is different, and more importantly, the reach of globalization is different. There are few places today which have not been penetrated by the same socio-economic cultural process. And instead of being an ideal and a process that affects the elite, globalization and I wouldn't say internationalism, but certainly globalization is now sort of is becoming more pervasive, more widespread. It's getting sort of more popular in some senses. Now, I've so far spoken about this new phase of globalization in relation to this earlier phase. And I want to go back to an even earlier phase of globalization, the tail end of which was the topic of discussion between Nehru and Gandhi. This is the phase of modern empire and imperial expansion. My focus remains on culture, though we must remember that in the context that I'm speaking of it, namely Asia, and in particular India, there's hardly a difference between culture and religion. So really, I'm going to be talking about religion. Now, why do I turn to this phase, this even earlier phase? Because I believe that many of faith-associated problems faced by countries such as India are a direct consequence of that phase of globalization and a particular model of faith and worship which evolved in Europe in the 16th, 17th century. That model is still with us today, and from time to time plays havoc with the lives of people in India. At least part of the persistent, intractable, almost insoluble character of problems related to faith or religions or religious conflict is due to the inheritance of that model. The so-called resurgence of religion in even Europe and the danger it poses to it and to many other parts of the world are due, at least in part, to that model of religion, which now is globalized. So what is this model? Now, this is something which sophisticated sociologists and some scholars of comparative religion know pretty much about, but it's not widely discussed among social scientists. Now, everybody knows that the Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648 to bring an end to the wars of religion, often doctrinal wars of religion, that had plagued Europe for over 100 years. What did this treaties do? Number one, it reduced the authority of the Pope. It made Christianity in Protestant states a matter of personal consciousness, privatization of religion, and not a feature of public institutions. Religion becomes a property of individuals. And C, it recognizes the power of princes to determine which version of Christianity would be dominant, i.e., this is the period of the birth of the confessional states. The religion of the prince would also be the religion of the subjects, and no prince would henceforth interfere with the religious character of other states. And with this, religion becomes a property of nation-states. This point can be put in another way, and I borrow here from Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the great scholar of comparative religion, who tried to articulate this by talking of the transformation, in a very schematic manner, talking of the transformation of religion as an adjective to religion as an abstract noun. And this is how he tells the story, I mean, briefly and schematically, that one begins first, or one first witnesses a dissenting teacher, say Jesus, a dissenting Jew, who then attracts followers, who then begin to identify with one another and form a loose community. This community then becomes more bounded, more closed, and particularly because it gets a certain organizational structure. And finally, it posits to itself an intellectual ideal which is deeply linked to this religious community organized in a particular way. And it is this thing, that's what's called a religion, a religious system. Now, the Westphalian Treaties sharpened even further the distinction between religious systems. It sort of carried this forward. And religious systems were now seen as rivals and as a source of division and strife. Surely, this is at the root of the idea of clash of civilizations that we see in the last 25 years or so. Now, what has it got to do with other parts of the world? Well, it was this form or model of religion that was globalized via imperial expansion. local, diverse, and fragmented cultural practices were transformed by being grouped together under European understandings of a recognizable system of religions or world religions. A conception not easily applicable in non-Western settings, and indeed not even applicable to settings within Europe before the signing of the Westphalian Treaty, although that's a little controversial. This was artificially imposed to these parts of the world. This conception first changed the religious experience of Europe, as I said, and then as Europeans began looking around the world armed with this conception, they discovered yet more religions. Local elites, in their attempts to stand up to Western power, especially to Christianity, helped to institutionalize their social reality on the European model and contributed to the formation of these religions. So Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on were born in the 18th century. Now, so we have a plurality of more self-conscious, closed, bounded systems of religion which were born and were now seen as religions not only contesting or competing with one another, but conflicting with one another. Indians, and that's what I was talking about, right? Indians were obliged to think of themselves as members of one or the other exclusive religious community, not just different from, but opposed to one another. A radically new form of religious communal conflict was born. So what I'm saying is that the basic cultural form, the form in which a group frames its experience and thinks about it, individuates it, and understands the world, the basic cultural form of many societies was fundamentally altered. In Asia, in India, people had hybrid identities, half this and half that, half Hindu, half Muslim. Composite identities, both Hindu and Muslim, or dynamic identities. You could be Hindu now at T1, time T1, Muslim at time T2, and Hindu again at time T3. This dynamic, and all this was fixed, and to use one of Craig's terms, people were given categorical identities. So now you exclusively belong to this or that religion, which had no longer porous boundaries. There was no longer boundary crossing, but you had to switch from one to the other. You had to cease being one and adopt something else. And with this, new forms of intra- and inter-religious dominations were born. New exclusions, new forms of marginalization, new oppressions, new forms of discrimination, and so on. Now, in response to this new modern version of religious diversity with distinct religions and a plural and differentiated world of religions, India responded by developing a very distinctive conception of the secular state, which talked not about the strict separation of religion from the state in order to protect individual liberty, which is something which is found in America or in some European countries. But what India developed was a conception of secular state which keeps, and I don't want to go into the details here, but we can take it up in discussion, that you have a secular state which keeps a principal distance from all religions in order to protect rights, both individual and group, and particularly the rights of minorities, religious minorities. And you also ensure that you give subsidies to religious minorities, recognizing that they are vulnerable. And even more importantly, you have to ensure that there is peace between communities. So rather than have an individualistic version of secularism, you had this group-sensitive conception of secularism. Rather than have strict separation, you had this idea of principal distance. And it is this model of secularism which embodied it's India's own version of what global moral norms are, while different religions embodied particularity and specific and different ethical visions. Now, I believe that this distinctive Indian solution to the problem of religious conflict and religious differences which lead to violent conflicts, this solution in India, in response to this globalized model of religion, was very, very distinctive. And I also believe that as Europe becomes more diverse, as it becomes more religiously heterogeneous, which it is becoming because of immigration and because of an intensified globalization, it is this model, rather than the American or the French models, or rather than the weak establishments that many European countries have, it is this model of secularism which, in my view, best embodies those global norms that one is looking for in order to reconcile diversity and universality. Okay, let me conclude by saying that this is still pretty much a weak response to a very major problem, which I'm claiming arose because of globalization of a particular form of religion that took place in the period of imperial expansion. The question that is worth asking is there a deeper, more far-reaching solution to the problem of religion? Because it is implicit in the very notion of religion, as it was formed in this 16th, 17th century in the doctrinal disputes within Europe, that the roots of conflict and exclusion lie, right? Now, in his great work, The Meaning and End of Religion, written in 1964, Wilfred Cantwell Smith proposed that the term religion be discarded. He argued that we should have, instead of religion, we should have two terms, piety on the one hand and cumulative tradition on the other. Interestingly, in the 50s, another person, an Indian, Jawaharlal Nehru, said something very similar. He said, and I quote, "Religion has lost all precise significance. It causes confusion and gives rise to interminable debate and argument. It is a word enveloped by intense passion and emotion. It would be better if it was dropped from usage altogether." And then he goes on, and I don't want to quote the whole thing. Now, if Nehru had the power of the princes who signed the Treaty of Westphalia, or who were the beneficiaries of the Westphalian Treaty, religion, indeed, the category would have disappeared from public discourse, at least in India. But ejecting a word is not the same thing as discarding a concept. And in any case, the concept, as I said, is firmly embedded in social practice, institutional reality, and public discourse in India. So the model of secularism, in response to this deep religious diversity, is just about fine. But we still have to begin thinking, and this is a point that was made both by both the speakers. We've got to think about alternative futures, right? So it's worth taking seriously the point that Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the great scholar, and Nehru, India's prime minister, made. The fact, the very floating of that idea that religion be discarded is a very productive idea. Gandhi made another suggestion, one that he practiced himself, and which is the hallmark of Asian faiths generally, as well as of the pre-religion faiths of India. He said, religion must not be seen as an authoritative and monolithic structure of ideas and practices, but as a resource from which one freely borrows whatever one finds attractive and persuasive. And Gandhi practiced it. He not only borrowed from the Jaina tradition and the Buddhist tradition, but also from the Christian tradition and the Vaishnava traditions. As mentioned, in Asia and to a certain degree in pre-modern West, what later came to be called religion was viewed as complex traditions of thought. Their teachings were available to all. Everyone partook of them, but what each person did with them was entirely up to her or him. In these traditions, which Gandhi embodied in his thought and practice, you find the idea not of a single, unitary, unique belonging, but of multiple attachments. And you also find a notion of intellectual freedom, which is a form of enlightenment before European Enlightenment. The proper way to protect diversity, and this was mentioned as one of the goals of UNESCO in the brief that was sent to us, would be to institutionalize this model of intellectual freedom as part of a global ethical vision. The best way to protect religious diversity is to get rid of religious systems and the idea of exclusion and strictly guarded bounded communities on which it depends. This will also help us develop effective global moral norms, and I believe that the norm of intellectual freedom is not just an intellectual norm for us, but it's also very much a moral norm which can be global. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your talk. I think that since we have about half an hour left in this session, a good idea might be to ask each of the speakers in turn to react to the presentations of the two other speakers, and then we could open up with questions, and I think this would perhaps stir up this. I don't know if any one of the speakers would like to start, perhaps Craig? You prefer that?
Would you like to come up here?
Okay.
It'd be easier for you to see who's asking questions.
And we'll weave in our responses to each other
Okay.
we respond to the audience.
Okay, well then we'll go ahead and immediately ask the audience for questions. There's a microphone right in front. Goodman.
Thank you very much for three very interesting presentations. And I must also add that I'm really out of any field of competence in my comments, so they are just sort of more streams of consciousness than anything else. The first point, which I think ties in also with arguments that you have made, is it might be useful to talk not of universalism, but of multiple universalisms. And the reasons for the way to illustrate this for me could be by rules of sports. And one of the interesting things of sports is that, let's say we have soccer, we have skiing, we have boxing and so on, and they are all guided by international rules. I would also guess that there are more people in the world that know about the rules of soccer than knows about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the thing is also that they are upheld by rules of technology. There are penalties. What is allowed in one sport is not allowed in another, and so on. And you can expand on this. And you have other types of universalisms. I have a credit card here, and just the size of it is an example of universalism, and it can be used. It's the golden section and so on. There are all sorts of rules embodied in this card. So we have this multiple universalism, so that is the first point. The other is that universalisms are vehicles for nationalism, or also for other types of identities. So I can identify as a Norwegian by the fact that we have universal rules of soccer because I can cheer on my own team. Okay, and it's the same, and I can also shift my loyalties and choose the sport that is the one where Norway is most successful at the moment. So that is really the vehicle, these universal rules for my different nationalisms. And the third point would be also that these universalisms are also opening up for transnational or global identities. I can share not just on the Norwegian team, I can share for, say, Manchester United. And I have, to use a concept that Craig has used before, there are all these virtual communities that are possible to generate on the basis of these universal rules. And my last point would then be that what one then could argue, what you have is what one could use, speaking metaphorically, Windows identities. And by Windows identities, I mean what you have on your screen. You can shift between Excel and Word, and you can Google and all these things. So rather than talking about one identity, these different universalisms makes it possible for me to shift. And then again, if I sort of push that metaphor, sometimes what happens is that one particular window freezes and it overrides all the others, and therefore I'm, so to speak, captured by a particular mode, and it can take vicious forms. So in sports I can become a hooligan, and I become a hooligan on behalf of Norway or on behalf of Manchester United. So it's these extreme reactions to these particular identities which are based on universal rules. So basically what I would like to have are your comments on this line of reasoning, rather than having sort of one universal set of rules in contrast to nationalism, that they are really vehicles and there are multiple, and there can be these, so to speak, freezings.
Okay, I'll go first. Sympathetic to all these points, Gudmund, though with differences of language that might extend into differences of concept. Let me just run through them. That there are multiple games in play might or might not be well conceptualized as multiple universalisms, depending on what we mean by universalism. And often we mean something that extends absolutely everywhere in a uniform manner and is exclusive. And part of what gives certain universal ways of thinking their power, say in human rights, is this idea that it applies absolutely everywhere and is in certain ways a trump card when it does. So to simply say that each of these games is a universalism, it seems to me, is to move away from the idea of universalism in a strong sense. And I'm sympathetic to the need to do that, and I think some of the ways in which Rajiv in his talk talked about multiple attachments and the local and fragmented and fluid and so forth, which has been evoked in a variety of different ways in subaltern studies and in other discourses, is very sympathetic. Whether we can talk about it in how to relate that to universalism, it seems to me, is the challenge, and to take it into the connection with nationalism. Nationalism is a kind of progressive universalism within boundaries. So it's not as though nationalism is the local, the parochial, or the smallest scale, right? The construction of nations involved the advance of the attempt at universal application of certain kinds of rule structures within boundaries of territory, population, and so forth. And the question before us is in part whether to raise the scale of this sort of formal universalism to a higher level, Europe or the world as a whole in some sense, or to achieve something more of the local, fragmented, multiplex, cross-cutting kinds of structures. And it seems to me that we're going to get some of each. And so the question isn't just multiples, because we aren't going to say there's football and soccer and rugby and on down the list of games, all of which are equal, and it's the all of which are equal is the universal part. We're going to be stuck in these various kinds of competitive struggles, partly because of material inequalities, and so we're not going to be able to simply have that sort of multiculturalism that the sports metaphor suggests, because there's going to be a competition for resources, and the basketball players are going to demand what the soccer players have or something. And as a result, we may appeal to these more universal rule structures like human rights, but we may also appeal to the formation of local cross-cutting identities and multiple affiliations. And so part of what worries me is that universalism and individualism go hand in hand and wipe out what's in between and these multiple identities. So I'm worried that we have a system for connecting individuals to the universal formal rules, and in the course of that, we gain something in terms of those formal rules, the rule of law, and we lose something in terms of the capacity to produce these more local, cross-cutting, multiple affiliation sorts of webs. And that happens with nationalism in certain ways in relation to more local communities and areas at borders. It happens in the larger scale too, and therefore I agree that we have multiple identities clearly, which we call the Windows identities, but I think that the limit of the metaphor is that they aren't equivalent. They get hierarchically structured. Some of them are able to embrace and incorporate others in an asymmetrical fashion, and then they get tied up in political processes.
I think I will go with the second point, you know, the nationalism point, because I think a problem that Craig associates with actually existing cosmopolitanism applies to our understanding of nationalism as well, because the idea of nationalism that we, if we consider ourselves to be part of that elite, that we have is not actually the nationalism that, you know, other people would understand. So, I mean, it may be possible for you to support the Norwegian team as well as supporting Manchester United, but for most people, supporting the Norwegian team would be excluding the possibility of supporting Manchester United. So that kind of benign nationalism, good nationalism, which some people associate with patriotism, is not usually or always possible in practice. In the other metaphor, using the other metaphor, it's not possible to shift windows, you know, as easily. We can, you, I, Craig, Rajiv, maybe, but in most cases it will freeze, and Microsoft will go on producing new XP in addition to Vista, and you know, it will come up with different things. But the problem is it's not going to be possible. That is my problem with nationalism. I mean, we do operate, as we operate with a, you know, different, I mean, David Held and Martin Nussbaum operate with a special conception of cosmopolitanism. We operate, as, let's say, scholars, social scientists, whatever we are, with a very benign form of nationalism, which is not actually, you know, usually possible. And we see this, you know, this is in different places. Now, a very quick point about multiple universalism. This was partly what I argued for in my presentation, but the point, of course, is that there have to be some ground rules. I mean, this is also the call for dialogue that some political theorists have been using and arguing for in their writings. The thing is, of course, in order to have a dialogue, you have to be able to sit around the table and to clarify the rules of engagement, and whose rules are these going to be. I mean, here it is very difficult to talk about multiplicity in that sense. Now, of course, that brings a host of other problems, like you know, whose rules, the Western rules, Eurocentric rules, and things like that. And that's why maybe I kind of, you know, I chose only one particular version of universalism in my speech, you know, Butler's, because this is, this shows, I mean, this kind of, you know, establishes in a very kind of hermeneutic, you know, way, universalism as a horizon, basically, which cannot be reached, but which you struggle for, you know, every single day maybe to reach in a way. Thank you.
Well, I'm actually sympathetic to the idea, certainly of multiple universalisms, but I'm getting more and more skeptical about the use of terms like rules and principles, universal rules and principles. So I'd really like to make a distinction between practices and the articulation of those practices, and sometimes the more sophisticated articulations of the practices in terms of rules universals. I think if we look at the embedded norms of many of our practices, you will find in those practices certain operational norms which are at a sufficiently abstract level shared. But at the moment you begin to articulate them, you'll find that the language of these rules and norms, are contested. I mean, let me give you examples. I know that there is, if we look at the world, there's violence, there's killing, there's rape, there's torture, there's genocide, there is greed and what the Greeks call pleonexia, there's possessive individualism, all that is there. But on the other hand, my guess is that the opposite of all this is far more widespread. There is more peace around. I hope I'm not being exaggeratedly optimistic, but it's not as if people are killing each other all the time. It's not as if people are, raping one another all the time. There's the torture or exploitation is another matter. But genocide, I mean, these don't happen routinely in the way in which everywhere they're not as pervasive. Now, what makes them not happen? What makes it possible for most people from one part of the world to travel to another part of the world without a sense of great danger and threat to their lives and bodily integrity and so on? What is it that makes it possible? I would say that embedded in them are certain norms which from one point of view look pretty local, but from another point of view are global, right? Now, let's say we have to articulate these norms, I don't see anything wrong with, say, these two articulations. Supposing someone says, don't kill someone or anyone, and the reason, and people ask that person, well, why? What justification do you have? And you say, well, each individual has a right to live, and you cannot violate that right. Well, if another individual comes and says, look, I don't want to kill that person because God has commanded me, thou shalt not kill. Now, the effect is the same. The person is not killed. But the two articulations and justifications are very different. I don't think we can find the same route to our norm or the same set of justifications for that norm. There has to be a plurality and multiplicity of justifications. But we can arrive at something which we all, in some ways, share without always knowing about it. So I find this way of thinking a little better. I have to think more about this idea of games and rules and the multiple universalisms thought through in those terms. But this is something which I find more and more amenable to my way of thinking.
We have a second question. Do you mind coming to the microphone? There's several of them.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting. It does make me think that the airport traveler is not the real figure that we should be using here, but the university and the educational system, which has its own credit cards in terms of degrees and enabling people to speak pretty much a common language on fundamental issues. In my own experience, however, it seems to me none of the issues that are raised here are answerable in the terms on which they're raised. If we just think in terms of the way in which memory, the way in which obligation, the way in which internal relationships of social solidarity, of family, of sexuality, of practically all the meaning space that people have in their lives can be associated with a great many different forms of particularisms. And those particularisms can be transported from one place to another, to the point where any violation of those common meanings, common understandings, mutual obligations, the way in which people hold their lives together, the meaning space in which they live, these are all seen in other contexts as somehow being violated by a host country, unless there are very special ways to make the transition from one set, not just simply of identities, but the whole way in which people interact with each other. Memory, history, obligation, association, education, all these are questions that seems to me infinitely more relevant to the kinds of things we're talking about than these higher principles, because any universality can be seen in terms of its parochialism, and any parochialism can claim a certain kind of universality, and there's no end to the relationships between them.
So, that was David Apter, who didn't introduce himself. I'm very sympathetic to all of that, David. So my general claim, not in the language of universalism and multiculturalism, is one about historically forged connections and the opportunity to reforge them to some extent. So it seems to me that taking history seriously means both taking the weight of what we inherit from history seriously, which includes issues of memory and culture, but also includes material structures in the world, and taking seriously the fact that since it got made, that suggests there are opportunities to remake it, that it is not merely a fixed inheritance. And so we're embedded in this always essentially incomplete historical process with a variety of different attachments in that. So and that's one reason I'm made nervous by attempts to overdo the articulation of timeless universals as formal structures in relation to this. Let me work in a couple of comments here. First, let me thank Umut particularly for his engagement with my work in the paper and his very generous responses and good points of criticism, which made me think about it. But let me connect to a couple of points. Let me use your university metaphor first. I think the university is a great metaphor for this, and it points to two sides of this. There's an ideal in which the university is all about the universal and the connections among all the different lines of pursuit and all the different scholars in the university. There's a reality in which there are a variety of careerist individuals more attached to their discipline than to the university, moving from place to place, making their lives. There are departments with turf struggles claiming autonomy. No, it's really sociology, not economics. How dare they assert, right? The university is this complex set of relationships, and it seems to me that most universities rather poorly exhibit the universal, in a sense, and rather strongly exhibit the quasi-national conflict among departments and the aspirations of individuals. But the university also gives us, as a metaphor, the chance to think, what's the universal? And we could channel some versions of systems building approaches and imagine the universal as a well thought out complete whole. So for sociologists, the Talcott Parsons Niklas Luhmann version or something like this, but for others, other versions. And imagine it in terms of the system with a place for everything. And I think some versions of thinking about global order try to do that. They try to engineer everything, like the European Union trying to engineer everything down to the correct size for cafe umbrellas. Another way of thinking about it is a set of connections where there are always new possible connections. Oh, look, economists and psychologists are getting together and inventing behavioral economics, or now there are these other boundaries being crossed and new connections being formed. If we take it away from the university to the world, it seems to me we have something very different if we have a logic of an encompassing system and categorical equivalence of persons within it, all assistant professors, all associate professors, whatever. We have it often thought about the universal in the political world in terms of the total in this way, rather than in terms of the sum of connections, which are always incomplete and potentially growing and changing. And I'm much more attracted to this way of trying to think about connections. I think there are some occasions for thinking the other way, so I don't want to rule it out, but I think we need to to bring back connections. So in the same sense with the university, we need to think of the connections among fields, not just the correct organization of them. Any scheme that we came up with that said these are exactly the right departments would be wrong in 20 years if there's any progress in knowledge. And there would need to be a reorganization. It's the same here. And I think this fits with the sort of fluidity, hybridity notions too. We need all sorts of interdisciplinary programs in our university. So very briefly then to pull this back into more political terms. Ideas about the world being a whole, which are frequently articulated, beg the question, what makes the world whole? And this is in relation to Rajiv's comment. Is it divine creation and we are all God's creatures? Is it the equivalence of all human beings who deserve equal respect? Is it a deep environmental consciousness in which we mean the world as nature, as Gaia? I mean, there are a whole series of different ways we might think what makes the world whole and think how we are connected to other people in the world, which is the question, and in some part. And Rajiv articulates something like a Rawlsian overlapping consensus in which we can have a variety of different ways of connecting, but no single common denominator that necessarily runs through all of them. And I suspect that almost all successful global political projects are likely to have this character too. That is, that there are a variety of alliances and connections that get formed, a variety of ways in which people work out living together, which don't take the form of a universal that everybody agrees to. If we are going to overcome ethnic violence, it won't be because everybody reads Habermas or some philosopher and says, these are the rules we're going to follow entirely. It will be working out a variety of practices, often in local connections. Now, in that regard, the part of the problem, ironically, is reformist elites trying to fix the problems. So part of the story of the history of religion that Rajiv alludes to very quickly is reformist elites trying to improve the internal coherence of these different religious systems, not only the colonial imposers, but people on the other side, and in the era of the Reformation in Europe, trying to make the rules clearer, trying to make sure that ordinary people follow those rules just as strictly as monks and priests, and producing a much more doctrinally driven, authoritatively structured version of religion as a result, trying to drive out syncretisms and things like this. I think we've seen the same thing at national levels, and this is often where there are some of the most pernicious versions of nationalism and things. And we imagine this as the backwardness of the people, but it's often the reformist elites trying to produce more conformity according to something more like a universal principle who produce this. It's not just the backwardness of the people.
I entirely agree with Craig, but I'll take up your point as well. But let me just say one thing. Till this, you know, the Shariat Act was introduced in India in 1937, and it began to overrule all the customary practices of a wide variety of Muslims who understood their Muslimness in different ways. And many of these Muslims, as I mentioned, participated in practices which were common to, which they held in common with Hindus. The Khojas, the Menons, the Mios. I mean, I can name a whole lot of people in India who were like that. And the attempt of the reformers was that there should be one law for all Muslims in India, and that law was encoded with the help of the British colonialists in 1937 and became the Sharia Act. But, and it was from within that law that you had these personal laws, right? The Muslim personal law, which is such a major, you know, which is so controversial in India today, as indeed in many other places. Now, till the 1970s, in Delhi, most Muslims did not even know of the Muslim personal law. They didn't refer to the Muslim personal law. I mean, this is something which I've been talking to various people, and they told me this. It's only in the 80s that, with the beginning of globalization, that the Muslim personal law becomes becomes operative. So it's as recent as that. So I completely agree that the reformist zeal of elites is also responsible for a very large number of problems which afflict at least our societies today. I completely agree with you on memory and history, but of course it's a double-edged sword, right? Memory, I'm reminded with David Hume, who said that like property, people also inherit animosities. And these animosities are at play even when the material foundation or the social foundation for those animosities have disappeared. So it's out of habit that people hate each other. And that hatred between one another can be responsible for a huge amount of catastrophic violence and so on. So we've got to find a way of not remembering certain things. Selective. Hobbes had a great solution. Hobbes thought that an entire society can be created by collective amnesia. So that's one issue. But the other is, of course, amnesia, selective amnesia itself. And one of the reasons why I really got into the history of this, the globalization of the category of religion, was to remind ourselves that religion itself, as we understand it today, is a construction, and an imperial construction at that. And the most vociferous champions of that version of religion and that version of the nation as a social form are militant Hindutva people in India today. I mean, they are the ones who talk most about cultural difference, cultural distinction, and so on. But at the same time, at the most basic level, it is these people who have, blindly taken on a model which is so distant from the conceptions of their faith, which was still available to people in India at the popular level, and which were available to a whole variety of people in India before this whole business of religion became strong after the 18th century in India.
Hello, my name is Sindre Bangstad. I'm an associate professor at Oslo University College. First of all, I'd like to appeal to the panel's sense of vanity. It's a great privilege for me as a young scholar to have two of my very favorite social scientists on the same panel in my hometown, namely Professor Bhargava and Professor Calhoun. Now, I had two questions, one specifically for Professor Bhargava. Now, as we all now know, contestation of secularism comes from multiple angles. You have the opposition of the post-colonial left, who objects to secularism on the basis that it's a reflection of an imperialist, universalist project, and then you have the opposition from the right, for instance, the Hindu right in India, as we both know. Now, the BJP, if I'm not completely mistaken, has objected to the fact that the Indian state doesn't force the codification of Muslim personal law on Indian Muslims, as demonstrating that the Indian state is insufficiently secular. Indian seculars do not live up to the principles. Now, but how does one respond to this? And I see your work as a principled defense of a sort of qualified defense of secularism in today's world. But I also get the sense from your work that there's a kind of danger of slippage here, in slipping into the notion of secularism as synonymous with cosmopolitan and virtuous, religion and nationalism as being parochial and vicious. Now, secularism in today's Europe, as we all know, generates its own forces of exclusion, and they're quite prevalent. So in the words of Talal Asad then, how in this context does one preserve secularism's virtues without also preserving its vices? Secondly, to Professor Calhoun and the rest of the panel. Now, I wanted to know whether you could say something about the extent to which the multicultural society comes at a price, because some of the most unequal societies on earth also happens to be some of the most plural societies on earth. I'm thinking particularly of the United States, South Africa, and India, which scores very badly on the measures of social inequality, the Gini coefficient. The reason why this is a particular concern of me is that in Norway these days, those on the right who argue for a dismantling on the welfare state always point to the United States as a model in these terms. In other words, the argument goes, in Norway, Somalis don't work. In the US, they do. And therefore, the problem is the welfare state. Thank you.
Briefly, I think we're running out of time, aren't we? No, first of all, I don't believe that anything is an unambiguous good, right? And that holds true for secularism. But even more so for secularism, because secularism, in the version that I try to articulate, is laden with multiple values, and these values come into conflict with one another. And so each time as this conflict presents itself, you've got to exercise judgment, insight, diagnostic skills, sensitivity to context, and so on, in order to somehow reconcile and balance these values. And so secularism for me is a very unstable perspective. I won't call it a doctrine, but very unstable perspective. One of the reasons why it is unstable is precisely what you mentioned, but you thought that I was actually, I slip into making secularism cosmopolitan and universalistic. And I think I made, in the presentation, I did sort of mistakenly present it like that, but that's sort of more or less unintended, because in the work, my work, I never do that, because, again, the idea, I'm very influenced by the idea that you can't just bypass particularity. Craig also shares that. You can't bypass it, you've got to pass through it. And that's what I think about, cultural groups. That's what I think of nationalities, and so jumping over them doesn't solve the problem. And so this model of secularism actually recognizes religious communities, and these are particular religious communities. And in fact, the model of this secularism can be found in the Indian Constitution. The Indian Constitution is perhaps one of the first constitutions to actually recognize as not only the secularity of its state, but also religious communities. And the need for state to fund religious minorities in the running of their educational schools and institutions and so on. So I think there's again this balance of the two, the universal, of global principles or norms, but obviously with a slant of a distinct local slant. I don't believe that there can be a universal which is entirely free of that local tone and as well as particularity, which is even which is much thicker in its specificity. Right.
It's always a good idea to appeal to the vanity of the panelists, but we'll try not to let that keep us talking past the allotted time. Though I should give a plug to the book Rethinking Secularism, in which Rajiv and I both have contributions and discussions coming out with a lot of others. Quickly, multiculturalism at a price? Well, in a way, yes. I think that Rajiv's answered already. There's no such thing as simply any one of these goods being the good. There are multiple goods balanced in various ways here. So cosmopolitanism is not the good. Multiculturalism is not the good. Even peace and so forth, not the good. There are a variety of goods in a complex relationship to each other, and it is often the case that some of them are more good for some people in a society than for others. In this case, there are a variety of political forms like empires, which are multicultural and are currently out of fashion in various ways. The markets may be a much more radically market-oriented and capitalist unequal society may be able to be multicultural in certain easier ways than a welfare state. And part of my point for saying don't dismiss nationalism or nations out of hand is the connections to welfare states and the connections to other kinds of formations. But I want to accept Umut's criticism and say that I don't mean to claim to have any basis for saying exclusively that only a national formation can produce that, only that the existing successes are very often national formations, and we shouldn't dismiss them out of hand. So I want to accept Umut's criticism of saying don't equate culture with national culture and don't privilege nationalism. I want to say, though, don't dismiss it either, because it is so bound up with a variety of institutions that some change over time may be important in those institutions, but an overnight change or an image of just bypassing the nation, or for that matter, religion and other solidarities, is potentially politically pernicious. One other point Umut makes that is right, although here I want to qualify it and relate it to the answer to your question, is that the psychological need to belong, if you will, is unevenly distributed. Not everyone feels it as much. I think that's right, but I think the qualification is it's not just a question of psychological need, it's a question of embeddedness in institutions. So for 8 years, I kept cringing at the inclusion within the category American under the Bush administration, and I find it easier under the Obama administration. I'm not more or less American now than I was during those previous 8 years, and even when I didn't like being associated with my government's policies, it was my government, and it was my political issue in part to try to change that government. And so I think that the issue of belonging isn't just one of psychological need, it's one of recognizing the institutions within which one is embedded, and my embeddedness within the American polity wasn't something that I could just throw off and say, well, hey, I'm a global cosmopolitan, and I don't agree with George Bush, it's not my problem. It is and was my problem, and to some extent the world's problem because of what America and Americans did. And so, in that sense, the same thing goes for your Somali example. Somali's work in the US, not all bad. The US is wonderfully good at incorporating immigrants in many ways. That's one of its great strengths. It's astonishingly unequal. That's one of its real weaknesses. And the struggle to try to get a better balance between those two is important. Do you want to add anything?
I'd like to, on your behalf, really thank our three speakers for taking us through a really fascinating, interesting, and challenging journey. And I think there is something that underlies all of it, and in a sense, Craig's just reflected yet again. It is to resist taking on the categories and not look inside them. It's thinking about the context, and it's really working with a deeply historical perspective that reminds us that a lot of things we suddenly think we've discovered are actually things that have been around for some time. Whether you call them universals or not could be another issue. But they are things that have framed us, they embed us, and they are issues that we struggle with in various ways. And I think that's really the thing that's come through. And moving towards a simple version of any of the solutions is probably not good for any of the contexts in which we work. So anyway, thank you very much indeed, and now you have your coffee.